Trump's people landed in Ukraine while Zelensky missed them during negotiations in Turkey. The US and Russia are holding secret talks about a ceasefire. About Ukraine, without Ukraine.
The work is being coordinated by Witkoff, who is discussing the details with the Russian representative Dmitriev.
At the negotiations in Turkey, the Kremlin is backing down again.
Peskov stated that Moscow doesn't even understand what there is to talk about.
A military aid package from Spain worth 615 million euros.
Spain is providing Ukraine with 40 Iris-T air defense missiles.
Significant aid from Spain amounting to 300 million euros.
Trump's new sanctions are not a threat to Russia. Nothing new, really.
While the bill is still in progress, we don't yet understand what its fate will be or exactly what Trump supported.
Yet another stab in the back from Putin's ally.
Imports of Russian oil to China have already dropped by 45%. This decline will continue. Deliveries will decrease by another 2/3.
And Trump just keeps getting disappointed.
I'm a bit surprised by Putin. This is taking longer than I thought.
So Zelensky flew to Erdogan in Turkey. Meanwhile, Trump's envoys are already in Ukraine. The international publication writes about certain American generals who are bringing a peace plan that is supposedly being discussed behind Ukraine's back with the Kremlin, after which they are supposed to go to Moscow and, so to speak, discuss the finalization of this plan there. How much of this is true, we are going to discuss with you right now. In addition, we'll talk about how the Trump administration might actually move from this developed plan to action. And we're not talking about carrots here, but about sticks. Who will be on the receiving end of these measures is something we'll also discuss with you after the segment. Who will be on the receiving end of these measures is something we'll also discuss with you after the segment. I'll be waiting for you in the studio. Let's go.
America is preparing to deliver the most painful blow to the Kremlin. Donald Trump is making it perfectly clear. The era of soft sanctions is over. If Russia does not stop the war, the world must cut off its oxygen.
Any country that does business with Russia will face very serious sanctions.
The US president is ready to sign a new package of sanctions against the Russian Federation. According to Reuters, the White House has already signaled Congress. The 47th president will approve the bill, but only on his own terms. If it includes a provision that gives him the personal, exclusive right to make the final decision on whether to impose sanctions or not. This is exactly what has become the main bargaining chip.
For the White House and the president, it has always been important that the sanctions package contains a clause guaranteeing the president the right to make the final decision on sanctions. Therefore, if this is included, I think the president will consider signing the bill, a White House source said.
The bill was authored by Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Richard Blumenthal. The document provides for 500% tariffs on imports from countries that purchase Russian oil, gas, and uranium. The goal is not just to strike at the Kremlin, but also to cut off the lifeline to all of Moscow's partners who continue to support the financing of the war.
At this point, Trump's determination to once again put additional pressure on the Russian Federation, particularly on its oil market, is quite strong.
Trump's new sanctions could deal a devastating blow to the Kremlin's economy. The Russian oil market risks losing its key buyers. India, China, and Middle Eastern countries are under threat. Trump, meanwhile, proposes to expand the list of targets and add Iran to the sanctions list, a country that helps Moscow circumvent restrictions and strengthen oil schemes.
When we clearly understand that 60% of Russian oil is bought by China and the Americans are unlikely to escalate sanctions against them, let's say any kind of sanctions, especially after the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump, where they essentially agreed on a one-year pause on imposing mutual sanctions. Most likely part of the Russian oil market in China will remain. At the same time, countries that were the second and third largest buyers of Russian oil, namely India and Turkey, are now actively seeking alternative sources of supply. And
while across the ocean they are preparing to deliver a decisive blow, REFA is dealing with the consequences of yet another sanctions package. At the end of October, the US introduced a new package of sanctions against the Russian oil sector. Rosneft, Lukoil, and 31 of their subsidiaries were subjected to restrictions.
They have already caused serious disruption. The Russian market plummeted sharply. The price of Urals really did drop dramatically. And at the same time, Yes, as of today, there is a very serious problem with foreign assets, particularly those of Lukoil. At the same time, we've already heard that the American company Chevron has received preliminary approval from the US Treasury Department to negotiate with Lukoil about purchasing their foreign assets. The approximate value of this package is estimated at around $20 billion. Well, in any case, such developments are underway and we're watching closely. That is, we need to understand that the assets we're talking about are the very instruments through which the Russian Federation sells its oil. If these instruments fall into other hands, Russia will have significantly fewer opportunities to maintain the current volume of oil sales.
If Trump still signs the bill, and countries under US pressure reduce their purchases, the blow to Russia's budget revenues will be catastrophic. Even Russian propaganda will no longer be able to hide the real economic consequences. And the Kremlin will feel pressure it has not experienced throughout the entire full-scale war.
Until we see the final version of the bill, until it is at least approved by the majority of the American parliament, in this situation, it is nothing more than, let's say, a threat.
Political technologist Oleg Pasternak is joining our broadcast. So, Oleg, here's the next question for you. Is Politico magazine really trying to tell us something? Let's think about what that might be. Because they are writing that there is some kind of plan between the American administration, which sent its high-ranking military officials to convey to Zelensky their vision of how the war with Russia should end. First of all, what do you think about this plan? Does the UN even exist? How effective can it really be? And in general, how should we perceive all of this? As pressure or as a continuation of the previous negotiation track? What's your opinion?
Well, without the points, it's hardly possible to talk about this systematically and in detail, so we can only rely on two reports, one in Axios and one in Politico. 28 points, let's call them the updated peace proposals from Trump, which include broader and more comprehensive issues than just the pursuit of peace in Ukraine, namely the overall security situation in Europe, the establishment of reliable and credible security guarantees, and possibly even complex questions of nuclear deterrence and strategic stability. And then it becomes apparent, if that's truly the case, then the underlying logic and rationale behind the actions and decisions of the current American administration becomes much more clear and understandable. Since it's impossible to resolve the Ukraine-Russia issue solely as their own case, why not include it in a more global arrangement, which concerns, for example, issues of NATO, continental security, security guarantees to ensure non-aggression against Europe, against Russia, and so on. It seems to me that Witkoff and other representatives of the Trump administration will try to revive the peace program, which hit a dead end after Anchorage and led to oil sanctions and to the current threat of sanctions being imposed by Congress. But I wouldn't say this is a revival of another chance for a peaceful settlement. Rather, it's a trial run and an attempt by Witkoff to at least make some progress on the case of the Ukrainian-Russian war and at least achieve minimal results in terms of strengthening his ability to exert influence under Trump. So that's how I would look at it. Once these 20 specific points are published, we can, of course, discuss them in detail. The fact is, for example, that on issues like territory or the demilitarization of Ukraine or compromises related to Russia's demand to change some of Ukraine's internal legislation, these will not be accepted by Ukraine. I think that's already clear. Otherwise, right now, we would already be discussing a meeting between Witkoff and Zelensky in Turkey, which previously was very actively announced by many well-known and reputable media outlets, as reported by various sources, and so on. And if we are to believe the information that perhaps Merov, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, had, the NSDC had, some proposals were passed on from the Americans, and then, naturally, these proposals were voiced. Of Ukraine, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and apparently did not generate much enthusiasm in Ukraine, then it can be assumed that this is why the meeting with Vitkov did not take place. Because the story that there is some kind of corruption trail and that Vitkov did not want to be associated with it seems to me to be far-fetched, although it is a very convenient smokescreen to justify yet another lack of progress in the peace process. But to break through Ukraine using blackmail, pressure, and influence is a task with an asterisk for the American administration. As we have already seen, the position of the Europeans and the stubbornness, well-argued stubbornness, of the Ukrainian authorities regarding the crude imposition of American-Russian peace initiatives, let's call them that collectively, they didn't work until recently. Now, the situation is somewhat different because Ukraine's domestic political environment has become more complicated due to the corruption crisis, which will continue to undermine President Zelensky's position, his legitimacy, and his agency for a long time to come. The ability to maintain this power vertical. Therefore, those analysts are indeed correct who, after careful consideration and thorough examination, link all these various internal Ukrainian twists and turns, developments, and political maneuvers precisely to the sources of international influence and pressure on the Russia-Ukraine issue. These analysts, who attempt to tie this entire complex situation together into one big interconnected chain, are expecting, or at least hoping, that the Ukrainian authorities will, over time, become more accommodating, more open to dialogue, more willing to compromise, more flexible in their positions, and more sensitive to a renewed, possibly American-Russian proposal. But for some reason, I think that for the Ukrainian authorities, there are no such arguments, even given their weakened position within the country. It's unlikely that the Americans will be able to simply impose certain points so easily. Putin, the war criminal, would very much like to see himself at the end of a peace settlement.
Let's talk again about the visits, which you have already partially mentioned. Zelensky is in Turkey, so a meeting with Erdogan is expected. What is the role of this meeting in ending the war? Could you please tell us, because on the eve of the meeting, Zelensky also said that Ankara could become a platform for such a meeting, for such a format. Is there something key here? Or at least, I don't know, do you think there might be some seed that could emerge from this meeting which could lead to a peace track? Or, well, tell us, how do you see it?
It seems to me this is just a regular bilateral visit. The topic of peace is relevant, important, and fundamental, but as you can see from the results of the press conference and briefings, there were no particularly unusual statements. There were no signals before or after, and I wouldn't associate this with any major success in terms of the peace case. This is a typical diplomatic meeting aimed at strengthening Ukraine, especially in this context, which is very important because Russian drones struck a Turkish vessel on the Danube. And of course, the president of Ukraine probably used this argument to encourage greater Turkish involvement, both in terms of military cooperation and direct military support for Ukraine. Naturally, we need to look at the results and the main basic narratives that accompany this meeting.
All right, Oleg, here's another question. Please tell us, the Kremlin has stated that there will be no Russian representatives in Turkey. Peskov was the first to announce this. He also said, among other things, that it's unclear what kind of contacts with the American military, those I mentioned at the beginning, who are supposedly supposed to offer the Kremlin a peace plan, are being referred to. In fact, that's not being discussed at all. Please explain, it really seems like one side is trying to come up with something, while the other side couldn't care less and remains indifferent. I mean, the Kremlin and Moscow. Or are we missing something?
No, I'm afraid that, on the contrary, the Russian side actually reacted very strongly and emotionally to the prospect, for example, of a Turkish meeting between Utkin and Zelensky, because Peskov seemed quite perplexed when commenting on this event. However, it didn't take place, so apparently it didn't fit into Moscow's scenario. As for the visits of American generals, this is at the level of the Army Secretary and the Chief of Staff of the Army. Look, American military officials very rarely visited Ukrainian territory during and after Trump's victory. Apparently, this meeting is noteworthy and quite significant. Why? I have several theories about this. First, most likely it is to analyze in detail, in contact with Ukrainian military officials, the real state of combat operations and Ukraine's role and capabilities in repelling more intense attacks from the Russian army's personnel. The second point is that when a group of military officials is present, as a rule, they work out more practical technical details. For example, if Trump's peace plan and his latest updated proposals are moving forward, then naturally the issue is about a ceasefire and monitoring the ceasefire system, including with the help of American satellites. This is exactly what could be assumed about the need for the presence of American military personnel for initial contacts in the direction of this idea. In addition to this, of course, there is Ukrainian-American military cooperation, including both drone programs and missile programs. You know that recently Ukraine's general staff reported very successfully on the use of American ATACMS missiles in the Voronezh region. And the event is in many ways quite interesting. It goes beyond the usual picture of combat operations that we are used to monitoring. Naturally, this apparently requires some analysis from the American military leadership regarding these consequences and possibilities. Obviously, this is important in light of the news that the Americans have approved the sale of equipment and support for the missiles. Interceptors, or to be more precise and specific, the ongoing process of modernization and upgrading of certain advanced Patriot air defense systems, which, if successfully implemented, would allow us to significantly improve and enhance our overall ability and capacity to shoot down and intercept Russian missiles, as well as unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly referred to as drones. Apparently, the issue and topic of this particular air defense system was also brought up, discussed, and addressed during these important meetings and consultations.
All right, moving on. Here's another piece of information that I think is important. I want to discuss it with you. The Wall Street Journal reports the following, that it is time to recognize that Russian President Vladimir Putin likely sees any realistic end to the war, according to this American publication and its analysts, through negotiations as a threat to his rule. These conclusions are based on US intelligence data. What do you think about this? Because there is a camp that says Putin would like to end the war, but only if it ends with Ukraine's capitulation. Others say that neither Ukraine's capitulation nor Ukraine giving up control over its territories would suit Putin, because for him, the very process of war is essentially synonymous with the continuation of his power. What do you think?
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Let's start with the fact that I would hardly assume that Putin himself has an answer to this question, because there are undoubtedly risks for his internal regime. The war has become a very convenient, self-serving, and ultimately necessary way to strengthen the domestic political situation in Russia. Despite the price Russia is paying, Putin's regime in no way, it has never at any point in the past been as thoroughly polished, refined, and entirely predictable as it is now for the vast and complex bureaucracy that both serves and exerts control at the entire federal level, as well as in every single region across the country, meticulously monitoring and overseeing all internal political processes and developments within the nation. So, of course, there is always a risk, a potential for unforeseen consequences or unexpected developments, even in such a well-organized and tightly managed system. Why? Because there is a certain segment of Russian society that firmly rejects any peaceful resolution with Ukraine, because in their minds, there is a purely genocidal model of the complete destruction of the enemy. The peddling of the topic of the Kyiv regime, supposedly neo-Nazi in quotation marks, and the prospect of signing some kind of peace deal, with a neo-Nazi regime, yes, in quotation marks. So then for Russians, the question arises, did Putin really win this war, or did he not win it, like Stalin did in 1945 by accepting Germany's surrender? In other words, against his contrived historical backdrop, Putin does not appear to be the person he would like to be, from Peter the Firmus and Catherine II to Stalin. This is a very important component that influences his behavior. Well, we find it funny, and the West might not understand it, but for him personally, apparently, this is the framework that defines his worldview, his understanding of the essence of this conflict. That is why he is risking the enduring strength and influence and power of his regime immediately after the war ends and beyond. Russia will face a colossal amount of economic and social problems after the war ends. Society will need an explanation as to where, in fact, Putin spent such a number of casualties, the killed and wounded, and what the results are. Even the capture of 20% of Ukraine's territory is not the most acceptable and certainly a sellable result for the Russian masses. The results of the war. A part of society affected by nationalist propaganda and chauvinistic frenzy will consider these results unsatisfactory. And of course, for Putin and them, it will look weak and half-hearted, unfinished, incomplete, not brought to an end. The reckless venture that was started in 2022. Therefore, undoubtedly, for these reasons, a peaceful deal with Ukraine on any kind of compromise terms is not beneficial for Putin. He needs to create the appearance that his maximalism and obsession have been realized in the results of the political settlement in Ukraine, which he is currently counting on right now. Thank you.
Very much. Oleg Pasternak, political technologist, was on Ukraine today. All the best to you. Goodbye.
Take care.